When Professor Sick and Dr. Meyer approached me about this lecture last March, I provided the title before you that's been mentioned and the following short synopsis. Just read this for you because I had to anticipate this week some 6 months ago. American anxiety about the country's future has provided the unmistakable backdrop for the electoral season of 2012. Although the economy continues to mend, polls show that 1 week before Election Day, Americans across the country are deeply concerned about the nation's direction. The domestic variant of this debate focuses on the ability of Americans to still attain the so-called American dream, or in shorthand, the opportunity for citizens to achieve the socio-economic mobility they seek. Extending from and interrelated with the national debate about prospects for economic power and societal dynamism are the diverse arguments centering on the country's place in global affairs. Anxieties stem here from perceptions of decline, that America's exceptional role in the 20th century slowly is giving way to withering influence and abilities to exert power. The electoral season of 2012 has witnessed an intense and fundamental debate among Americans about the essential qualities of the American experiment in Republican democracy and the extent to which it will thrive in the coming decades. Results from Election Day 2012 will thus determine basic elements of the country's course and its contributions to global affairs. And that was the synopsis I said 6 months ago. Now, one can certainly debate if we have witnessed an intense and fundamental debate about the course of the country. We're referring to that. Both Democrats and Republicans insist that we have. We have certainly witnessed and are witnessing an intense election, with the thrusts and parries of daily news cycles and gotcha politics seeming sometimes to trivialize what is in fact a very important decision moment in American history. On the other hand, the zeitgeist assessment on my part from last spring still holds muster, I would suggest. As the wicked winds of Hurricane Sandy batter American shores, the willful winds of history seem to be steering America into a storm of domestic turmoil and international drift that withers away at what many see as one of the country's relative great strengths, a type of natural optimism that tomorrow will bring a better day. While polls should suggest that a majority of Americans still indeed believe in this optimism, hold this optimism, there has been a notable decline in the basic faith among Americans in the American dream, or this fundamental assumption that the next generation will enjoy further socioeconomic mobility and greater degrees of physical and psychological security. What I want to do for tonight is lay out a threefold argument. One, looking at American debates itself, and how, in fact, this represents a long tradition in the United States, and what to many Americans and even more international observers can understandably be seen as a sign of declining confidence or capabilities, is actually rather a confusion caused by robust democratic debate in the United States currently about the course of the country, often leading to new forms of consensus, as in the past, with which to steer the state and society. Dissonance and defeatism are two different things. Second of all, I want to point out the global constellation in which the United States currently finds itself, in which American power has always found itself evolving, and while this will mean in the future the continuing relative decline of American power and influence, it will not occur as many project along the lines of past empires, be they Soviet, British, French, Dutch, or Roman. And lastly, I want to point out some important reasons for the above observation about the global constellation of American power, and how the combination of 6 inherent strengths for the United States will assure that it remains a global economic, military, and political power well into the 21st century. Now, we find ourselves at the Columbus Day Lecture in Bonn. In that sphere, I sail into my argument with some confidence, and of course not knowing much of the course ahead. As the American political scientist Joseph Nye put it so pithily recently, is the United States in decline? The honest answer is that no one knows. I can only bet with near certainty that I am in decline. At a minimum, what I would like to outline for you tonight is a more complex and contextualized cartography that will perhaps allow you to locate contemporary American politics somewhat differently, and thus perhaps steer your perception of this confusing country in a slightly different direction. Not necessarily the right direction, caveat emptor. At the end of the day, I personally cannot help but conclude that the economic, social, political, and cultural cartography of contemporary America remains deeply dynamic, thus making competition, contestation, confrontation almost pre-programmed into American society. But that this dynamism will ultimately mean that the spirit of seeking new frontiers and discovering new spaces for experimentation will continue to shape the American experience as it unfolds in our current century. Sorry about my cold, but okay, the first component of what I'd like to sort of discuss today. America debates itself in the larger historical context. If you look at the debate in the United States about exceptionalism and declinism, you can really see sort of three things interrelated. One are notions of exceptionalism and declinism. The other is, particularly since the latter 19th century, ideas of rising inequality in the society and what that means for notions of exceptionalism and decline. And lastly, how these two interrelate, what it means for notions of tolerance or intolerance in American society and the overall social contract. Now, for the many students of American history in the room, you know that really almost the metaphors of exceptionalism and declinism have been around for a long time, really from the beginning of the country's competing narratives. Go back to at least Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson, and looking at notions of Hamilton's ideas of the need for industrial economy, great power, projection of power, to play a certain type of role. At the same time, relatively conservative in terms of the projection of American power, versus Thomas Jefferson warning about the industrial might and what that could pull the country into, talking about more of an agrarian society, and at the same time being very idealistic, talking about the need for the United States to support the French Revolution, support revolution worldwide. And each arguing in their own way about the dangers of possible decline politically and economically, and the consequences of if the other side won the debate. From very early on, we see very bitter, very animated, very emotional debates in the country about notions of exceptionalism and notions of decline, and assurances from the other side that if the other side won, the country surely would enter into a period of decline, would lose its exceptional character. And we've seen this repeatedly. Go to the beginning of the 20th century, Woodrow Wilson in his debates, versus, for example, the populist politician and Democrat William Jennings Bryan talking about the dangers of capital, the dangers of international intervention. This would erode the fabric of the country and lead to long-term decline. Jump to the latter 20th century. Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan's promises of a new capitalistic dynamism in American society, the country's exceptional role in the world and the need to pursue that. Against Jimmy Carter's arguments about the country has to return to its exceptional character at home, a type of virtue, a type of Jeffersonian virtuous republicanism. And if you take these examples, what you see is this debate that indeed is taking place in the current political season between Mitt Romney and Barack Obama has a long history in American politics. These narratives of exceptionalism and decline, whatever you want to think about them, they have been as animated and as dark as we perhaps experience them today as well in the past, where both sides argue if the other side carries the day, the country is going to lose its essential character. And what we hear today from Mitt Romney is a type of, I try to phrase this as accurately as possible, and I think it's a fair description, sort of, and I don't mean this in a negative way, but a type of neo-Cold War exceptionalism, arguing about the need for unambiguous global American leadership and insertion of authority, versus what I see as a more conservative, nation-building, at-home exceptional narrative of Barack Obama. Both talk about exceptionalism, but with different emphasis. Both talk about the dangers of decline, but with a different emphasis. Both pick up on the long tradition in American history of arguing about relative merits of definitions of exceptionalism and decline, both politically and economically. And that's why, in part, I would argue the race is so close. Because Americans hear both arguments from Mitt Romney and Barack Obama and find merits in both sides of the debate. It's not about wanting to play sheriff. That's too simple an argument, I would suggest. But about both sides talking about the way that America can exert influence globally, if you will, the very nature of politics, exerting influence. And at what price in terms of cost to the country, whether it's treasure, blood, or the character of the country itself. This really goes back to Hamilton and Jefferson, the debate between the two. How do you exert influence? What is the cost to the country in terms of material costs, actual life and death, and also the character of the country? And that fundamental debate is in important respects the debate that Romney and Obama are carrying to the American people. In that sense, exceptionalism and declinism and debates about how to define these concepts have led through American history to narratives of engaging global affairs and focusing more inward, of seeking to build global structures of governance, to reforming society at home. The debate has always been highly competitive, contextual, and about relative degrees of consensus. And, as I pointed out at the beginning, since the latter 19th century, this exceptionalism, declinism debate has been accompanied by bouts of inequality and societal reaction to it. Indeed, as we know from both sides, especially from the Democratic camp, the rising inequality in American society is pointing to as a clear indicator of the relative decline of American power, the loss of any sort of sense of exceptionalism in the American narrative. Again, this is a theme we've seen throughout American history since the latter 19th century, certainly since the Second Industrial Revolution began to transform the American economy in the latter 19th century. And the profound debate that unleashed among American social reformers and politicians about what to do with rising inequality in American society. This is in part what unleashes progressivism, the era of progressivism, supported by both moderate Republicans and moderate Democrats. It's this rising inequality in the nature of American society that also leads Franklin Delano Roosevelt to come to power, to propose a New Deal to counter the rising inequality in the context of the Great Depression. And it's also what leads Lyndon Baines Johnson, in sort of a unique moment in terms of rising national prosperity, to launch the Great Society, arguing that we see, despite rising prosperity in our society, growing inequality, especially in terms of senior poverty, old age poverty, and child poverty. So the rising inequality we have in American society is of great concern. Both sides agree to that. It's not unique if you look at earlier periods of rising inequality in American society, latter 19th century, 1930s, 1960s. So the debate that we see happening, again, between Romney and Obama is Romney arguing we need more room for producing wealth, we need the state to stop distributing wealth, or distribute wealth less avidly. Whereas Obama's arguing, much as Teddy Roosevelt did as a Republican in the early 20th century, what we really need is a so-called square deal. We need the state to get more involved in providing greater access. And again, as with the debates about exceptionalism and declinism, Americans hear both sides of this debate and see merits in both sides of the debate. And that's why, despite the Occupy Wall Street movement, which I think sometimes people misunderstand in terms of American society, Americans don't want to overthrow capitalism or destroy or remove capitalism. What Americans fundamentally want, and that's why I think ultimately Occupy Wall Street was, if you will, such a dud in American society overall. It didn't lead to larger change or have a larger consequence. Is that Americans aren't interested in, as you put it in German, Klimapolitik. They're not interested in politics controlling capitalism or having the upper hand on capitalism. But what they want is a new relationship between politics and capitalism, readjusting that relationship so that there is more access, if you will, to socio-economic opportunity. In short,